Why is completing things so difficult? As artists, we are so excited to start new things, new media, new projects, new ideas. But as a group, our track record for finishing those things is, well, not great. In this episode, we are going to take a look at finishing things, why it's often more difficult for artists, the benefits of completing work, and then, hopefully, some strategies to help extend our excitement through till the end. Let's take a look. As we start, let's take a moment to clarify the issue. Artists tend to be excited about exploration. That curiosity is often what leads us into the medium in the first place, the desire to play, to explore, to try new things. Artists are often the first to explore new technologies, card games, video games, board games, and the like. We have an innate desire to consume and to experience. Often this is done more internally than the rest of the populace, but not always. So we start lots of things. I guess all of this boils down to we get excited, we try new things, and then we don't finish them. So why? Perhaps the first reason is all too simple. We start too many things. When we have too many things we're trying to juggle simultaneously, it becomes quite difficult to track them all. And yet, often we end up doing just that. So the issues that proceed from here on forward are going to be a little bit more in depth, a little less obvious. And let's start with a lack of motivation. Our excitement often pulls us in and then runs dry. Motivation burns like a quick flame. It often is so powerful at the beginning, it propels us into the new thing. We get excited about a particular art style after witnessing it for the first time, after playing a video game. I ran into this with Elden Ring, looking at all of these characters that are falling apart in this decrepit world, and of course my art very quickly turned to trees, to things that are intertangled and woven together, and there's still a little bit of that shining through in my artwork. So motivation can ignite things quickly like gasoline on a fire, but it alone is not enough fuel to propel us forward indefinitely. We don't have a reason to finish the thing if this is how we get started. We didn't think it through entirely, we just dove in. And of course, this is a wonderful trait of artists, the ability to dive into new things excitedly. But this is also one of the leading causes for us not finishing or completing the thing. We didn't think it through entirely, and our motivation just pulls the rug out from under us. How often do you get halfway through a drawing and just go, I'm not feeling it anymore, and you move on? If you look at any of my sketchbooks, if you look at the recent sketchbook tour that I posted, you'll see that I often do the same thing. I get halfway through a drawing and I just go, whatever. Now, I let myself do that with sketchbooks because, in my mind particularly, sketchbooks are built for practice, for fun, and for joy. And so if I'm not feeling it in a sketch, I'm not necessarily going to push myself to finish. The piece that you see in the background, however, right now playing out has taken me a long time. It still sits unfinished to my right as I record this. I will finish this piece, even if I don't feel like it, because finishing it is important. Not only do I use it here for footage, but it's something in the back of my mind that tells me I completed a thing, and I feel better about myself if I do that, and I get better if I do that. Another reason is the dealing with the finality of the thing. Completing things is difficult from a psychological perspective. On a weird note, I have a very good friend that would always get to the end boss, the last boss in these video games we played as children, and he would inevitably put the game down and not complete it. This drove me nuts, primarily because I sat in the background watching him play Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VIII, these gargantuan games that you had to work through, and I didn't play them. I think I was a little too freaked out, honestly, and I didn't own the systems that allowed me to do that. So I would hang out in his very dark, very scary basement while he played these games, and I would draw or just watch, and inevitably he would get to the end and not complete the last boss. And when I talked to him about it, especially years later, unpacking these things, there seemed to be this element of, I don't want it to be done. When it's complete, I have to walk away. And the story is finished, and there's a sadness to that. People run into this with book series all the time. When I read through The Lord of the Rings in high school, I devoured The Fellowship of the Ring. I annihilated The Two Towers, which is my favorite of the three. And I labored through The Return of the King. But when I came to the end, Frodo had destroyed the ring, They were back in Minas Tirith, and I stopped. Now, for those of you who've only watched the movies, that seems like kind of where it stops, but it's not that simple. I knew what loomed, actually. I knew that the scouring of the Shire, the depressing end when the hobbits come back home and find that home doesn't exist anymore, still laid before them, and I didn't want to end the journey. I ended the journey on a high note. The ring has been destroyed. We're in this illustrious state of euphoria following triumph and victory, and I didn't want to let that go. So I didn't finish the book until I reread them just several years ago in 2020, 2021. So I had somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 16 years of having not finished what is my favorite book series. It's an odd thing, but we are odd creatures, humans. Our psychology informs all of these interesting components of how we pull apart our world. And so weird things like this happens. But when you finish a piece, it closes that chapter. When you finish a sketchbook, it closes that chapter. For some people, that is difficult. Not for everyone, but again, most of these are going to be that way, where one or two might really be what echoes in your mind as we move through them. The next thing is pretty straightforward. It is a lack of time. If you have 5 hours a week to work on art, that might be a completed piece, but when you get excited and you start 17 pieces, the math is no longer in your favor. Artists often struggle with prioritizing or with organization, and with how busy our lives are, it can be difficult to find the time or set aside the time to finish things. We have so many things that are important to us that looking at a dozen different things that all require our attention and probably require significant thought as well, that's daunting, and often it's easier to be pulled aside by the tantalizing idea of a new project and just add to that pile. But yet we do this. Some people do this with books, where they'll start a book and then they'll start another book and start another book. Some people do this with video games. I have another friend that I have this joking question that I ask him frequently, where I'll just say, hey, out of the last 10 video games you've played, what percentage of them have you completed? And he always just kind of chuckles because he has a tendency to just grab the new video game, play it for a while, and he doesn't finish it. Which, would bother some people to no end at all. But to him, he enjoys the experience and he gets excited about the new thing. Some of us do that with our art. Now, if you're trying to get a career or you're in school or you're working full-time, this takes on a whole different perspective. If you are putting in 40 or 50 hours a week to work and school, then finding the time to make your art is actually quite difficult. So you might have to change how you're approaching things in order to make sure that's achieved. But also, if you're trying to get into an artistic career in any capacity, then you do have a stronger impetus to figure out how to find that time. And so hopefully later on in this podcast, we'll talk through some of the strategies that you might be able to use that might be able to help you with that situation. Another thing is, if you live at home with your family might not quite get it. They might not quite understand what it is that you're trying to do and why, and that can make it difficult. If you've got family dinners, if everyone else is hanging out in the living room and you're sitting there going, goodness guys, I love you, but I've got work that needs to be done, then that's a difficult situation. I often wait until my family is asleep, till both my wife and daughter are asleep before I begin making my art or writing. Or I try to sneak it in while my daughter's napping in the middle of the day because she still naps for 2 hours a day, which is lovely for a 4.5-year-old. And maybe you have to wait for everyone to go to sleep because your mom always makes you sit down and watch TV when she gets off work. We all have our individual things. We all have our situations, and we have to figure out how to work within those confines. And this leads into our next issue, which is distractions. The same traits that get us excited to move into new artistic ventures also pull us into video games, into books, and other fantastic things that still distract us from our artwork. Now, there's nothing wrong with these things innately, but if you find yourself surrounded with a plethora of unfinished work and the desire to have it finished, think about where your spare time goes. If you've listened to me much on this channel at all, you know I don't have anything against video games or books. I enjoy them both, but I try to segregate them to portions of my life. I've started listening to more audiobooks, and I do that while I'm driving, or I do that while I'm doing things like dishes, things that don't require a whole lot of brain power. Sometimes working out, but I find that I tend to count when I'm working out, and so that doesn't work well for me. But I've got a good friend who he's not a bodybuilder, but he kind of looks like it sometimes, especially when you work out alongside him, And he listens to books on Audible while he's working out. And that's fantastic that he can do it. He also does it at like 2.2 or 2.5 times speed, which seems insane to me. Reminds me of Data from Star Trek. I just cannot do that. I do like 1.2 and feel pretty good about myself. So try to think about the things that could be distractions or could potentially be distractions in your life. If you are playing a lot of video games, if you're spending 10 hours a week reading, could you allocate some of that time in different ways? Could you get up a little bit earlier? Could you stay up a little bit earlier? A little bit later? That would make more sense now, wouldn't it? Could you take some of your reading time if you're an obsessive reader and convert it into audiobooks? Could you spend a little bit less time between things being unproductive? I don't know. I've tried to shave down some of these batches of time so that my time is more efficiently spent, but it's going to be different for every person. Sometimes it can be as simple as a loss of interest. Sometimes we simply lose the excitement that got us into the thing that we're working on. Perhaps this is similar to losing your motivation with a piece, but sometimes motivation can pull you through when interest is absent. Interest will often pull us through as its own motivation. I've finished many things simply because I'm curious about where they're going to go, especially on sketchbook sessions and things like that, where I just start working with pen and I don't really have any idea. There's an innate curiosity to, well, how am I going to finish this creature? What's the background going to be? How's this going to function? Not everybody works that way. I kind of enjoy moving from the highly regimented things like recording podcasts and writing scripts to play, which is essentially what my drawing with ink is much of the time. Not drawings like this. This one had to be planned out. But we need the balance. We need to be somewhere in between all those things. Art ought to be fun in some capacity at least, and a lack of fun can easily lead to a lack of interest. So sometimes you might not be finishing your work simply because you've lost interest in it. You've lost interest in the particular piece, the thing you were exploring, the medium, or art in general. And this can lead to a difficulty in finishing things and should lead to a bout of internal dialogue, as it were, just to try to decipher why that has happened. Sometimes we don't finish pieces for the interesting reason of the fact that the piece itself is experimental. Maybe it doesn't need to be finished. Sometimes we don't have to finish things because that's not the point. Practice is, what would it mean to finish practice? If you have a sketchbook that's full of figural studies, how do you look at each of those pages and go, yes, this is completed, this is finished? Not every piece has to be finished. Not every piece is for that purpose. When I'm practicing with a new media, what does finished mean? Finished means I have learned what I need to for that, which means sometimes I walk away from things faster because it's frustrating, because I'm learning a new thing and I can't get it to execute the exact way that I want it to. So don't beat yourself up over things like this. Practice is just, practice. Practice for the real thing. That's what you're working toward. Okay, that was not an exhaustive list, but let's move into some of the good things, shall we? Let's talk about the benefits of completing things, of finishing your work. A sense of accomplishment. I really don't think this one can be overstated. Humans need to have a sense of purpose, benchmarks they can look back on in order to validate their decisions. Completed work can give you this, even if it's in just a small capacity. We benefit from the knowledge and the physical object of our success, looking back and saying, yes, I do finish things, I can complete things, I can make a painting. Because until you've finished that painting, you've walked away from that sketchbook, truly you can't say you've done the thing. And sometimes people get locked into this terrible place of, I'm not really an artist, I've never, whatever. I mean, there's so many variables that people throw out there, and most of them are just dumb. But if you finish the thing, you have that sense of accomplishment. You have an actual artifact, something that you can look at and go, I guess I am kind of a painter. I did finish this painting after all, and I don't hate it with every fiber of my being. Feeling success is often one of the best things you can do to ensure long-term commitment to a thing. No one likes to continue at something that they feel like they're failing at constantly. My first principal, the first principal that I taught under as a teacher, was a lovely human being. He was a wonderful man, and I learned a lot about teaching and a lot about just humanity in general from him. But one of the beautiful things that I learned from him early on in my teaching career was how he saw the teacher's role, especially with young students, in introducing them to success. So what he would do in his classroom is he would set up scenarios where a student was exposed to a difficulty, something that was artificially constructed by him, because most of what happens in the art room is, or not the art room, but just classroom in general, is constructed by the teacher. He would construct scenarios that would allow a student to taste success, especially in an area that was difficult to them. He was a math teacher, and he primarily taught the first year that I taught with him, the math class for students who struggle with math. So he had some of the hardest students who'd beat themselves down and taught themselves for ages that they can't do math. Math is not for them. They're dumb. Terrible things for kids to teach themselves and to tell themselves. But he would artificially create scenarios that would allow the students to taste success. He would create a scenario where they could succeed mathematically and feel that success, feel what it felt like to be good at math. And when I say he artificially created them, I mean everything in a classroom is artificially created, so it's not that he's being manipulative. He's just creating a scenario where the student can go, oh my goodness, I can do this. I can succeed. And the buy-in from the students was tremendous, because he was just showing them, you can do this. You can learn this thing. It's just, you have to bite it off in smaller pieces. You can't jump 2 or 3 grade levels ahead. You're gonna have to work at a lower level at first, but you too can learn this and you can succeed. We as humans need to taste success in order to understand how alluring it is. It's kind of like in Greek and Roman mythology when like people tried to get ambrosia, the food of the gods, and it's like if they got a taste of it, it's like, oh my goodness, this is amazing. Once you know what success feels like, once you know what success tastes like, it becomes alluring and intoxicating, and for some people it becomes quite addictive. And most of the time that's probably a good thing, especially if finishing pieces is something that you need to encourage yourself to do. Finishing pieces can increase your confidence. With pieces complete, you know for certain that you are able to complete things. It's easier to have confidence when you have a benchmark that exists, and this is kind of echoing what I was just mentioning. So, oh yeah, I did those 10 paintings, I made that comic, maybe it's terrible, but I finished it. You have confidence in your capacity to finish, if not in your skill level. Confidence can be hard for artists, but completing things that you work on can help aid the building of that confidence. And maybe the first thing is just, I can complete things, and then over time you can add on to that to have some level of confidence in your skill, your ability to execute, your ability to do things that are beautiful. It can be reassuring when it feels like the world is growing dim, like there's a shadow cast over you, that every other artist is so much better than you. Having some assurance that you are capable of completing things, and the things that you complete have gotten better over time. Well, progress is a wonderful thing to observe in yourself. Sometimes finishing a piece can just reduce your stress. If you're stressed or anxious about finishing something, the actual completion of the thing can be a release of that stress. I get nervous about making certain types of phone calls or going to the dentist, but following through, having that thing done, I find that the stress melts away. The same is often true for art pieces. I have pieces that sit in the corner of my studio, anxiously awaiting my return, and they hang over me. When I actually sit down to work on them, to complete them, there is a feeling of satisfaction, a release of the anxiety and stress associated with it, and in some cases, a release of the guilt. If I purchased a whole bunch of art supplies, different kinds of things for making paintings and filling sketchbooks, and those supplies sit around my studio unused and the pieces incomplete, there can be a sense of guilt, a sense of hesitation to purchase more supplies or to move forward, and sometimes that can loom overhead. So there's a reduction in these negative feelings associated with the completion of artwork, and sometimes just finishing some pieces can dismantle that stress, that anxiety, and even sometimes the guilt. There's often an emotional release when you finish a piece as well. If the piece is near and dear to you, that often makes it far more difficult to work on because there's a little bit of innate fear about messing it up. The other side of this is that when you complete it, there's often an emotional release. Perhaps this is similar to the reduction in stress and anxiety, but sometimes it's more of a flush of positive emotion rather than a release of the negative emotions. This might be important for you, or this might be one that just doesn't interact with you at all. As always, examine yourself. Get to know you. Finishing pieces can reinforce a positive self-image as well. Tying back into self-confidence, your self-image as an artist can often be improved the more your track record of finishing things improves. We beat ourselves up quite a bit as artists. In fact, I have a whole podcast on why artists are so hard on themselves if you want to or need to check that out. Finishing things is like fabricating a brick to the wall of our self-image. It serves as a foundation for who we are as artists, perhaps who we are as human beings. And a finished piece is hard to ignore when you look back later. Growth is another fundamental benefit of finishing pieces. A lot of growth occurs in the final stages of a project. The things you learn while finishing a piece are exclusive to finishing a piece. I've heard a lot of artists talk about this. There's a lot that you can gain in the last stages of something. Compositional choices, for example, have to be made early on because you can't shift major components of your piece unless you're working digitally and you're less concerned about those things. But even if you're working digitally, it's still hard to do. The things that you learn, that you grow from in the final stages, are different than the things that you benefit from in the early stages. So if you want to grow entirely as an artist, as an entire unit, then you're going to have to finish pieces and not just start a whole bunch of little ones. We have this unceasing desire to improve, many of us, and growth occurs in the final stages, just like it does through the early ones. Finishing pieces builds resilience. It is seldom easy to finish a piece. There are usually stages along that path that are difficult. The more you force yourself through that, you learn how you function and how you need to work when things are difficult, the more resilience you're going to build up. If this is something that you want to have as a hobby for the rest of your life, a certain level of resilience is going to be required. But if this is something that you want to do professionally, or you want to break into the industry in some capacity at some point in your life, you are going to need a high level of resilience. And resilience is pretty much built by working through tough things and holding on for dear life. All right, I have 3 last benefits here that are super practical, and we're going to speed through them before we get into some quick strategies on how to help you finish your work more frequently. These super practical things are the ability to share, the ability to sell, and the ability to get a grade. So if you are completing artwork, you're working it all the way through, you have things to share with other people. You can post it online so you can show other people what you've done. You can share your exploits and your joy with them. Often you can teach people because you can actually walk them through how to do it themselves because you've done that as well, and that's something you can share. If you are seeking to actually make money with your artwork, completing it seems to be a pretty fundamental component. Once you finish paintings, if they are of a high enough quality, they are now something that you can make money from, something that you can sell. So obviously, if you're going to try to make any kind of income from your artworks, finishing things is going to be quite important. This is also going to be important if you're putting things into a portfolio. I guess I would put that under this sell category here. And the last one there is the ability to get a grade. If you're in school, whether high school, college, anywhere along that line, finishing pieces gets you a grade, and hopefully a better grade with the higher quality that your piece is achieving. And so these are super practical things, but they are also important and things that we shouldn't shy away from. At the end of the day, there are a lot of wonderful benefits, psychological and practical, to finishing your artwork, to finishing more artwork. Now, let's take a look at some of the things that we can do practically, psychologically, to help ourselves finish more of the artwork that we start. First off, prioritize. Especially if you find yourself listening to this with the sheer quantity of things you have in the air weighing down on you, start prioritizing. Get out a sticky note or your phone and literally start writing out all of the different things and place them in an order of importance, or perhaps an order of how much time they'll take to complete. Give yourself a list of things to start working through. And more importantly, give yourself the list of where they are in level of importance to you. Set deadlines for individual pieces and stick to them. Be generous with yourself at first. Set some deadlines for your pieces, but if you think a piece is going to take you a week, give yourself 2 or 3. And don't go overboard for it at first as well. Don't set deadlines for all of the 13 pieces that are resting on your floor, preventing you from being able to walk between the bathroom and your bed in some kind of normal fashion. Try with just a deadline for the first piece. And when that one works or doesn't work, evaluate how that went. Was the deadline too strenuous? Was the deadline too loose? You can evaluate and then make a decision for your next deadline. Then apply that deadline only to the next piece and keep moving forward. Keep your space clean and organized. This clears you of distractions, which was one of the issues that we talked about earlier, but also it can make it easier to dive into your pieces. So when you walk into the space that you use to create art, whether that is an art studio, a space set aside particularly for that in your house, or if it's just the dining room table, if everything is clean, if things are organized, you don't have that first initial layer of stress and anxiety about the space. You can just dive in. Now, not everybody is messed with by unclean spaces, but many people are. And if you're not, probably the people that you live with are. So keeping the space cleaned and organized can make it way easier to finish things because it makes it easier to engage in the work. You can often set up the next piece if you're organized as well. You can make sure that things are easy to get into, that all of your supplies are set out and they're ready to go. Track your progress. This doesn't work for everyone, but it helps me a lot. It feels like a game. Can I write more today or art more today than I did yesterday? Can I beat last week's high score? I've done this for years. I tracked for a very long time how many minutes a day I put into art. I kind of did this because I wanted to see what the actual quantity of time that was required for improvement was, which after I got to hundreds and hundreds of hours that I'd recorded, it just became a little bit arduous. And I also got into some routines where I was just making art every day regardless, and so I didn't need that artifice anymore. But large portions of my life, I have functioned this way. I see it as a game. I like tracking things because I like watching numbers accumulate. Maybe I should have been an accountant or gone into economics or something, but whatever. This is where I find myself. I like tracking things. I think it's fun. I do it now primarily just for my word counts as I work on writing my book. I count the amount of words that I do every day. It goes into a spreadsheet and that adds up and I can see that accumulate over time and I feel success for that accumulation. So if this is you, I would highly encourage that you employ that strategy, but for some people that will create additional anxiety and stress. So I've mentioned this before, but know yourself, know what's good for you, and don't try to implement my strategy just because I'm a different person who uses it. So figure out strategies that work for you. Break the project or piece down into its component parts. If the piece that you are not finishing is too daunting, break it down into its constituent pieces and bite into each one individually. Large-scale projects can often be intimidating because they have so many components, so many pieces, and of course, as normal human beings, we often dive into the pieces that we are most comfortable with first, and then we avoid the stressful ones until later. I've started to work against that as I get older because I find it's a better strategy to work on the hard things first. But that being said, if you have a large-scale piece, especially one that you got pulled into by motivation or excitement early, and now you're daunted by all of the pieces, break it down into all of its constituent parts. It's a background, it's a foreground, it's a middle ground. More than that, there's 3 figures in the foreground. Well, each one of those figures is a different thing. I can work on just the clothing for my figures or just the expressions, and you can do this over the course of days or weeks, whatever is necessary for the scale of piece. Try not to think of it as a giant project, as a giant piece. It is a whole bunch of tiny little things coming together to form a bigger thing, so try to break it down. Create a ritual of your art time. If you are able, set aside time to work on art and keep to it. This, at the very least, guarantees art time, and you can slowly start curving that toward finishing your incomplete pieces. This is something, again, that I've talked about a lot. I think it's super important. Whether you are a night owl or an early bird, I find it intriguing that both phrases are birds. But if you're either one of those, know yourself, figure out which one you can utilize. If you are a night owl, stay up later than everyone else and just dedicate an hour a day to working on your art. If you are an early bird, get up early, an hour before everyone else, and work on things. My favorite time of the day is to get up before anyone else in the house is up and sip on my coffee and listen to the birds outside. More birds. And then I can dedicate that to either planning or to intellectual time or to my artwork. But setting aside time, making a ritual of your art time will dedicate that time, and it'll make it easier for you to do that. Then, if your particular problem is that you're not finishing pieces, you can slowly start sculpting that time toward it. If it's stressful, maybe start with just half of that time on your daily ritual is dedicated towards finishing things, and the other half is dedicated towards fun things. Once the ritual time exists, though, it becomes a part of your daily life. It's a habit now, and habits are much easier to hold to. Celebrate the completing of a thing. Don't overestimate rewards. Try to give yourself something exciting to look forward to at the end of the piece. This is a little funny, but my father does this with all kinds of things. Whenever he has something he wants to achieve, he will set himself a goal and then a prize at the end. I can get a new video game when I run this marathon, or I can watch this TV series when I finish this project. This might be something that you can adapt for yourself, so consider rewarding yourself for sticking to the plan to finishing things. Different people are better at actually sticking to the plan and holding on to this. Some people reward themselves early. So if this works for you, if you are like my dad and you can egg yourself on to get to a certain point because there's something special sitting at the end of that thing, consider doing it. Otherwise, consider just rewarding yourself by feeling that satisfaction, by bragging to your partner, your spouse, your siblings, whoever in your life is particularly encouraging about your artwork. You can post it on Instagram and say, I finished this and I'm so happy that I finished this. Put it in the right kind of terms so people understand what they're looking at and how to encourage you and praise you for it. Celebrate the finishing of a thing if you find it difficult. We are all so different as human beings, and though this might be a struggle for you, and it might not be a struggle that you see in a lot of the people in your life, if it is a struggle for you and it is something that you are able then to learn how to work with and to succeed at, that is worth celebrating. That is a wonderful, wonderful thing. Limit how many things you start. Now, this should likely be the first of these strategies, as it's so fundamental. Moving forward, it's probably what you should do first, but the reality is most of us who are listening to this, and me as I'm writing this and recording it, we already are in this situation. I can't just stop starting too many things moving forward because I already have 75 things that are waiting for me to finish them. But once you get a hold on things, and as you move forward, start fewer things. Think about things before you start them. Make sure this is really what you want to do. This is really how you want to dedicate your time. Start thinking about your time as a resource. Start thinking about the finishing of pieces as a sign of success, a sign of pride, something that you can really enjoy, that you can really get behind. Completing things is hard, but important. I hope that this podcast has helped you in some way. I know it's allowed me to think through a lot of these things. What is your personal struggle with completing artworks? I would love to hear about it in the comments down below. As always, thank you for listening. Have a good one, y'all. See you soon.